This is Damian Macy, representing the Friends of the Marshall Public Library on our oral history project. And today is Thursday, October the 15th of 2015, and I'm at the Marshall Library with John Hasten. He's a long-term resident and a native of Marshall, been very actively involved in the community, and especially in the education field. So with that, I'll introduce you to John.
Good morning. My name is John Hasten. I was born on May the 10th, 1952, in Terre Haute, Indiana. My father was George Adam Hasten of Marshall and a lifelong resident of Marshall. My mother was Maud Imogene Korn Hasten, a resident originally of Oakland City, Indiana, and the surrounding areas. They met during World War II in Evansville, where Dad was welding, and on landing craft that were being built there. And he enlisted in the Navy during the war, and after the war they settled first in Peoria, then back here in Marshall. He was a handyman, could make almost anything out of metal or wood, welding and things like that. So he was always in the process of building or making something. And my mother worked in, before I was born, worked in the dime store and a couple different restaurants around town. She remembers James Jones coming into the restaurant and things like that. Then she was a mother for many years. After we reached old enough age to go to junior high and high school, she worked at Burnside's nursing home as an aide out there. And so that's kind of the background that I came from. My first place I lived was on the southeast corner of Plum and 11th Street. There was an apartment there owned by the Ellingtons, and my parents lived up there for 3 months. And then they purchased a house at 1102 Ash Street, where I lived from 1952 until 1974. When I was married, we lived 2 years on the west side of town, and then we bought the house from my parents on Ash Street when they moved out to where my grandparents had lived, and lived there from 76 to 1995. So their 11th and Ash is kind of where I grew up, and most of my adult life was there. We now live out in Gulf Lake subdivision.
When you were growing up, what school did you go to?
I went to the Old North School. The Old North School had originally been an academy of some kind, the Marshall Academy. The Marshall School District ended up having it. It was a neighborhood school, you might say. It was for the kids in the north end of town. All the south end kids and all the country kids went to South Elementary. It was a 3-story building with a basement. We had, kindergarten was originally at the old Ohio building, which is now the unit office for the Marshall School District. But then 1st grade through 6th grade was at the North School, which was walking distance from my house on Ash Street. And it was a good place. It was a neighborhood place. We could go there and play. I don't ever remember going there and playing any other time except while we were there at school. You always had playgrounds outside, played a lot of softball, things like that.
There was not a lot of fancy outside equipment
No.
for recreation, was there?
There was none. There was a backstop on the north side where the buses would park occasionally and drop kids off, but that was to keep balls and things from rolling across the street. There was an asphalt playground area on the east side, on the northeast side. It was primarily, it seemed like wet weather, bad weather. Mr. Ingram was our PE teacher, and he would take us outside. He was a bus driver and had the additional assignment of teaching PE, and so every so often he would come and take us outside and do things. The rest of it was mostly dirt because the grass had been worn off. And
when I went there, I recall there was some gravel or like cinders.
Oh, really?
And that was not very comfortable when you fell on it.
No, that wasn't a good thing.
As I recall, the inside was not what we'd call super modern by today's standards.
Oh, no. You could tell it was an old building and things. The restrooms were in the basement. There was no restrooms on any of the other floors. The main floor, or the first floor, I should say, was the younger grades, first grade, second grade, and there were 2 third grade sections. For some reason, I guess there were 2 thirds and 2 fourth grades, and once in a while, some of those alien kids from the South School would come up and fill the class for the additional third grade and additional fourth grade class. So you would meet kids from other parts of town or from the country. And that was different because they're invading our north area. Then there was only one, up on the second floor, there were 2 fourth grades, 1 fifth grade, and 1 sixth grade. And I remember my teachers very, very clearly. There was Mrs. Rhodes that taught first grade. She lived down by West Union, a nice lady as I remember. Doris Schaller was my second grade teacher. Ironically, she was also the first principal I had as a teacher at Marshall when I was in junior high. She was the junior high principal at the time. Still a very active lady, up in years, but is active a lot in Delta Kappa Gamma and some things. The first grade classroom was in the southwest corner of the building. Second grade was in the northwest corner of the building. The 2 third grades were on the east side. I had Mrs. Kuhn in third grade. She always seemed like she was like 90 years old from the time I was in there, and I'm sure she was probably in her 50s, but when you're a young person, everybody seemed older. I didn't have Mrs. Buckner. She was the other third grade teacher. Then in fourth grade, I had Mrs. Curran. That was upstairs on the east side, both of them on the east. Both fourth grades were on the east side. Mrs. Curran's was in the southeast corner, as Mrs. Coons was in third grade. And Mrs. Baker was the other fourth grade teacher. I didn't know her very well. My fifth grade class was on the northwest corner, as I remember it. And that was Mrs. Maurer, and it was one of her very first years of teaching. She made great cookies. We were impressed by the cookie making she had and enjoyed that a great deal. And it was probably before she had children, so we were able to be indulged a little. Mrs. Irwin was the sixth grade teacher on the southwest corner of the upstairs. Mrs. Irwin, I knew had a relationship to me. She was like third cousin or something. She very strict disciplinarian. You knew very much where all the lines were. I remember sitting in the back row on the outside window, and there were two other Johns around me, which made it kind of interesting when she'd call for somebody's name on which one was going to answer. But that year, probably the greatest thing that happened in that year that was most touching, that was the year that President Kennedy was assassinated. And we were in sixth grade, and there were televisions in every classroom because we learned Spanish from an airplane that was flying overhead, and it was broadcasting out of Channel 16 at WSIU, and we would learn Spanish that way. In the earlier grades, we had Mr. Holler, who taught Spanish and traveled to the various younger grades. But in fifth and sixth grade, we had the television to teach us Spanish, and we spent the rest of the day just watching the news of the assassination. And it was such a quiet class, and we were all just kind of taken aback. It was a terrible thing.
In fog.
Pardon?
Like in a fog.
Oh my! But I remember walking home after class and talking to my mother and turning on the news and trying to keep track of what was going on and things like that. I can still remember the funeral when his son walked down and saluted, and that it was very heart-rending.
And that's one of those unusual things. It seems like everyone, just about everyone, remembers where they were and what
Yes.
they were doing.
Exactly. There's a few other things like that. When the first man walked on the moon, the Challenger accident, when the spacecraft blew up, it had the first teacher on it that was going into space. I remember the first of all, the walking on the moon. I was working at Hudsonville Construction in the summer between going to classes, going to school. My dad worked down there for a construction company and got me a job down there. So I was working, and he called us all in to the office, and we listened to the first steps on the moon. And then I was teaching at Marshall in '85 when the Challenger accident happened, and we had the television on. I was teaching PE at the time, and we had television on in the gym just so everybody could watch, and then it blew up. And it was like, wow.
What happened? What happened?
Yeah. There's some things like that you always remember. Funny ones once in a while. I always kept the clock at basketball games for the boys' varsity. Janet kept the book, and Heather would sit between us and read a book. Holly would be with her friends. But it was a Friday night, and everybody was watching the basketball game, and all of a sudden somebody announced who shot JR, from Dallas, and evidently that was a very important thing for some people. So there's things like that go on.
Those years at Marshall North School, do you remember, was the third floor still in use at that time?
No, we never went to the third floor.
Okay.
There was a stairway up. Yeah. I knew where the stairway was outside the sixth grade classroom, but no one ever used it.
I went there too, and it was a music room.
Oh, really?
Father Arnie came over once a week.
Okay.
And we would go upstairs. Not ADA acceptable.
No.
Not safety standards by today. But anyway, there was piano up there, and we had a music.
Okay. Now, we never, ever went upstairs. Okay. Mrs. Wells was our music teacher.
Okay.
And Libby Wells. Mm-hmm. I saw her at the Clarksville restaurant. I see her there ever so often. She's out there quite a bit. She taught my daughters piano lessons for a while, but she would come and we'd go to the basement. There was a room in the basement someplace that we would sit down. I was not a musician of any way, shape, or form.
And as I remember, there were a couple of drinking fountains that were in the basement. There was no drinking fountains or anywhere upstairs, as I recall.
Now, I think when I had it, when I was there was a drinking fountain on each floor upstairs where you could go out of the classroom and get a drink.
I don't think there was back.
Mr. Hutchins was the custodian. Hutchins. And he lived over on Plum Street. But he was the custodian. But he was also the guy who sold you milk when it was milk time. And you would come and get your carton of milk for Mr. Hutchins. And so things like that you remember.
Sure. And that's why we're talking. Yeah. Did you go, 6 years then to that North School?
Yeah.
And then from there, I bet I know where you went.
The Marshall Junior High. There was a big building going on in the 50s because of the high school being damaged by the tornado, and they built the new high school. The generation that's about 10 years ahead of me can remember all the transition. By the time I got there, the junior high was back behind and it was functioning. My brother, who was a year behind me, I believe was maybe the last sixth grade class in the old North School, because at that time they were building the new North School and they began the demolition process. So we were one of the last class to be there at the old North School. Went to the junior high, a square building, and it seemed like a huge, mysterious place when you're sixth grade and you're used to where you're at, and everything was a square. You just walked around the square. Didn't get lost too badly.
And then moving on to high school, did you have a favorite subject in school?
I always liked science. I was science oriented. I love history. I remember I liked playing sports, and I was always good at baseball when I was younger. Played a little basketball in junior high, played a lot of football and basketball in high school, ran a little track. But I can remember sitting in Mrs. Perkins, you remember Mrs. Perkins? Genevieve Perkins. She lived about 2 doors down from me on Ash Street. Mowed her yard once in a while when she couldn't get it done. But I remember it being in her class in 8th grade and deciding that I wanted to be a teacher. That was what I wanted to do. And so then it was just figuring out as a teacher what I wanted to be teaching. And she taught history. I enjoyed history a great deal. I enjoyed science a lot. I had Mr. Lazier in 8th grade science, and he had some, it was kind of a new world that was opening up. When you get to junior high, your science becomes a little different than it is in grade school, and it was very interesting. So from that point on, I wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to coach sports. I wanted to teach history and science. And so I get to high school. Sciences were primarily my greatest interest. Mrs. Gardner was my biology teacher. Mr. Callis taught chemistry. But Mr. Wyke was a social studies teacher. He taught world history and civics and sociology. And I enjoyed Mr. Wyke's class immensely. And I was very honored. He passed away not long ago. But I had taken my mother to a doctor's appointment at the Cork Medical Center out here, and he and Mrs. Wyke were sitting in there. It was probably less than a month before he passed away. And I got a chance to go over and tell him just how much I appreciated his classes. He allowed you to think. I know that people accused him of being an atheist, and he was teaching Sunday school at the Methodist Church. They accused him of being a communist, and he ran for a state representative position on the Democratic Party. He was none of those things, but in class, he could debate and be the devil's advocate for everything you said because he wanted you to understand what you were saying and how to discuss and think about it deeper and in different ways. And when you got an attaboy from him, you really did something. It was a good thing. And of all the classes, I remember his classes the most and wanted to emulate his style of teaching the most when I started teaching. Finally, toward the end of my career, I got to teach some histories and sociology and some of those kind of things. So I could kind of fall into the way he taught, and I appreciated that.
From those years in high school and kind of setting a direction, here's what I want to do. But through those years, did you have some, going back, maybe you were living at home, did you have some chores and things that were required at home that you had to do? You mentioned mowing yards.
Yeah.
What kind of occupied your spare time?
Well, spare time.
If you had any?
Oh yeah, always had some spare time. I lived in town. We didn't have animals or livestock. We didn't farm. I didn't have a lot of chores as such. Mowing the yard was it, and once in a while I'd go around and mow a neighbor's yard or something. I remember as a young man, just a young boy, the greatest fun was those spring evenings when the sun would stay up just a little bit later, and when you're 5, 6, 7 and playing hide and go seek with the neighbor kids in the neighbor yard, just as the sun's going down, it's starting to get darker. We had a huge tree in the front yard, a tree of heaven. It was probably 6 foot in diameter, huge tree. And they're a fast growing tree. They die fairly quickly, and they can be a nuisance, but it was there in our yard, and that was always home base. And I appreciate the neighbors at the time. The area that we grew up at 11th and Ash had some open lots nearby. Stalls lived to the west of us, and there was an open lot to the west of them. Had a pitching mound on it that Jim Stahl used to pitch a lot in high school, and he would practice there. To the north of me, Mrs. Beals lived, and there was an open lot beside her. Glenn Mackey had an open lot, but nobody ever went there because Glenn was very picky about his yard and you didn't want to go in there. He was very nice. When we lived there and the girls were learning to ride their bicycles, he would bring them over because there was a little slope behind his house where they had dug a basement and it sloped off. And he said, bring them over, we'll teach them how to ride going down the slope. And it was the right thing to do. But as a boy growing up, you never went into Glenn's yard. The Tasty Freeze was not very far away, and the man who owned the Tasty Freeze lived in Casey, but there was an open lot back behind the Tasty Freeze where the retired Methodist pastor lives, but Reverend Deal lives there now. But it was all open, and because the owner was out of town, was rarely around, that was our playing field. We played football there, we played baseball there. For a quarter, we'd go to the Tasty Freeze, get the biggest Coke they had. So long as you had a quarter in your pocket, you were good. And then there was a little store diagonally across. It's now the bank, but to the northwest corner, there was a little store there. I don't remember the owner's name.
Van Arsendale.
Van Arsendale, that's right. You're right, Van Arsendale. And it was a dirty little junkie store. But for 15 cents, you could get 3 packs of baseball cards. And so if you had a quarter, you had a drink, you had baseball cards, and that's how you had a break in your game. That was halftime on whatever you were playing. Then north of that field, there weren't many houses back in there. It was all berry vines or briars and things like that. But nobody really cared. We would wander around as kids, play sports in the field. When we were younger, we'd grab our guns and play Army and go, and they were all toy guns, but we'd play Army and chase each other through the brush and underbrush and do things like that. It was very nice that we had open areas, rode our bicycles all over town. Nobody really cared. In the summer, you'd go to the pool once in a while, and it was all, if you know that 8th Street is about the crest of the rise of town from Ash Street, from where we were on 11th and Ash. You would ride from 11th to 8th Street, and you could coast all the way down to the pool from there because it was all slightly downhill. Now, of course, you had to come home someday, but that was all part of it. And we wandered mostly on the east side and north side of town. Didn't go to the southwest that much. Didn't know very many people over there.
So as a youngster, you really didn't have much of an opportunity to attend movies at the Old Strand Theater there, did you?
No. I do remember, there's a very vague memory when it burned. I don't remember what year it was.
56, 7,
somewhere in there. I think I remember my mother taking us. She didn't drive for a long time. I can remember my dad taught her to drive, but whenever we went anyplace, we walked, and we'd go to the store or something. And I remember walking with my mother around the courthouse and seeing the smoke come up from the movie theater that had burned, where the KP Lodge is now.
And I remember, and I'm sure you do too, at that particular time even, there were still a lot of small neighborhood grocery stores.
Oh, all of them.
All over town.
Yes, dotted all over. Here on Archer Avenue, there were 2 between, where was it, 11th and 12th Street. There were 2 of them right there. Then the one up by the Tasty Freeze, Van Arsdale, that had that one. Over on 2nd Street, Marshall's Grocery.
There's one out on West Archer also. I
don't think I remember that one.
She had a little DX station pump with.
Okay.
It's where the medicine shop used to be in the.
Oh, okay. I know where you're at. We talked a little earlier. I remember where Kroger was downtown here, about where the library is, and you'd walk in, and there was the old coffee grinding machine right there. And I loved the smell of ground coffee. And it was just, you'd go in there, and that was just something that you always knew. I don't drink coffee. I don't like the taste of it, but I always liked the smell of it. It's kind of like my grandfather's smoked a pipe. And I don't smoke. I never have. But you walked into my grandparents' house and there was a pipe smoke, and and I thought the pipe smoke smelled good, but I don't smoke, so.
On those years of going through high school, and you said, by golly, I'm going to become a teacher. Where did you go to school then?
After that,
What year did you graduate?
I graduated in 1970 from high school, and went to Eastern Illinois University. I've graduated 3 times from there. After graduating high school, you take the ACT. Things are a lot more stringent now. Kids are pushed a lot harder now to go to college. What college are you going to attend? You got to take these tests. You got to do well on the tests. We took the ACT because you had to, but nobody ever told us what it meant or what it was about. I remember driving up there, taking a test, not knowing what I had done, and drove home. Now everybody practices for it and all that. But after graduating high school, went up to Eastern, I went in as a zoology major, botany minor, and before I graduated, I had switched from a biology major, or a zoo major. I went to physical education because I wanted to coach. So I majored in physical education. I came out with a minor in zoology, botany, and history. I had a scholarship that paid tuition, so it was good for 4 years. I would take summer classes just because I liked going to school. I remember coming home from summer class. I'd take a morning class and I'd drive back home, and I'd go out and help my dad remodel my grandparents' house. He was remodeling it, and between about the time she passed away in 1970 and he moved into it in 76. So in that time that I was in college, I could come back and help him do things around as he was remodeling the house. Janet went to school with me.
Who's that?
Janet was, we started dating in 1968. If I was going to date her, I had to go to church to see her.
And her last name was?
Clapp. Janet Ellen Clapp. And she was been the love of my life. And we had played a lot of tic-tac-toe in Mrs. Frischkorn's math class in 7th grade when I really first kind of knew her. She was one of the aliens that came from South School and went to one of the 3rd grade classes and 4th grade classes at North, but I didn't know her there. But in 7th grade, we met again, sat beside each other, played a lot of tic-tac-toe instead of watching algebra, paying attention. She, and you're young at that point, you're friendly with people and things like that. I remember a freshman year in high school, a Sadie Hawkins dance, and I didn't go with anyone, but went to the dance, and she had gone with another boy and ended up leaving with me, so that's kind of a bad thing, I suppose. And we walked from school to Tom's, and after the dance was over. We started dating seriously in 1968. I was a sophomore on 68. I was 16. I was a junior on the football team playing, and I started going out to church at Clarksville because that's where she attended church. And you always went on Sunday morning and Sunday evening and Wednesdays if you wanted to see her. And Friday, where there's always a ball game someplace on Friday, and Saturday was a day of we wanted to go see a movie or something. That was date night. We decided we wanted to get married. Her father said, fine, you can get married if you want to, but if you get married before she goes to college, I'm not paying for it. So we figured we'd better wait till after college to get married, so he would pay for it. And that's what we did. She went to Eastern to be a business teacher, And at that time, women didn't have a lot of options. It was either you were a nurse or a teacher or a secretary, and that was kind of what most people looked at. And so she did two of them. She was a secretary teacher.
So you were both in school at EIU then
Yes.
at the same time?
Yep. We both graduated in 70. We both went to school. We graduated at Eastern in spring of 74. There was a lot of kids graduating with the same degrees that I had, or at least to teach physical education. I wanted to coach football, I knew that. I know I sent out 75 letters to openings throughout the state and never heard a thing back. We were going to get married in June, and it was the 1st of May and never heard anything. And so we postponed our wedding to August. And about a week later, I got a call from the university that said, there's a little school down south of you that needs a junior high teacher. And I said, but I want to coach football, and Hudsonville doesn't have football. And they said, well, go for the interview anyway. And I said, okay. I went for the interview. They offered me a job. I said I promised them 2 years, because I really wanted to go coach football. And the next week I got letters from Carlisle, Mount Zion, and Robinson asking me to come for an interview for football coaching. But I'd given my word, and
Choice.
I'd given my word. I said I'd give them 2 years. I promised them that. So I wasn't going to go back on my word. That's part of being an Eagle Scout. I was an Eagle Scout, spent a lot of time in Boy Scouts when I was in high school and junior high. And it was real important to me to keep my word. So I worked there for 2 years, coached basketball, track, baseball, taught science, health, physical education, a little of everything. And Janet got a job at South Elementary School as the librarian.
Convenient.
Secretary position. We made a grand total of $12,000 between us that first year. Thought we were in the money. Took a vacation, a little bit of a vacation, traveled out to Wyoming and saw Yellowstone and some things like that, and all driving, drove back, and started another school year. Was there 2 years. Then Dan Stevens was the principal at South Elementary at the time, and Janet was in the office at one point during the summer and overheard in the summer of 76 that Jim Lowe had left the junior high and was going to go to Maryville, Indiana. And he was an assistant football coach and taught junior high science. She came home and told me, so I applied. I got the job at Marshall, moved from Hudsonville to Marshall, was able to coach football and teach science.
Oh, you were living in Hudsonville?
No, we lived in town here on the west side on 4th Street.
Okay.
Dick Curran had a house there that he rented on 4th Street that we were in. My parents moved out to where my dad finally finished remodeling the house and moved out there. Then we moved back and bought the house from my parents on Ash Street. So I was back at Ash Street again in 76. And I was in Marshall at the junior high teaching and coaching there. Taught science. Most kind of a chemistry-based science, some biology. Coached football, junior high basketball, track. Before long, I was the high school baseball coach. And
what you wanted to do from the beginning. Right?
Yeah, right back where I was. And Mrs. Perkins' classroom was not too far from where mine was. I was in Stanley Lazier's old classroom there in the junior high. Taught there 4 years, and then Dick Parker decided to retire from teaching and go into the insurance sales business, and they needed a head football coach, and they offered me the job. And so I moved to the high school to teach PE then and coach football and be athletic director. Okay.
Did you ever think back in, saying when you were in college, that you might be teaching back in Marshall again?
Yes, I did. In fact, I never thought of teaching anywhere else. This is why one of these other jobs showed up. It was like, It's not Marshall. I was such a Marshall kid. Marshall's colors are red and white. Their school song is Illinois Loyalty, okay? I was a senior in high school before I realized that the University of Illinois was not red and white. They're blue and orange. They had the same song, Illinois Loyalty. I was absorbed with my small town, my town here. I was absorbed with Marshall. I mean, why would I want to go anywhere else? You know, there's mean people in Paris, you know, stuff like that. So I never really thought of being anywhere else. And so when the opportunity to come back to Marshall, that was great. It was where I thought I needed to be. My parents were here. My wife's parents were here. This was home. This is where our church was. We're active in our church. I think God wanted me to be here. And I really believe that. There were some situations in my life where I could have gone. Okay, I've had other schools talk to me. When I was coaching football at Marshall, we had a good amount of success. I've had other places talk about, why don't you come over here and coach, or why don't you go there? But I think God wanted me in Marshall. I think for lots of different reasons. It was a great place to raise my kids. It was a great place to be when my parents needed help as they got older. My in-laws needed help as they got older. It was where God wanted us to be. I taught at Marshall for 30 years. I was football coach, head football coach for 22, assistant for 4, assistant principal for 6 years in that mix, 5 years as principal. But 30 years total I was at Marshall. I wanted to be superintendent at Marshall. And Russ Ross, the superintendent, kind of groomed me for that position. It didn't work out. And when they hired someone else, I was very disappointed. And I got to looking around. I had my superintendency. I could do things. I got to looking around. And Palestine had a position that was open. I didn't apply because on the application it said, got to move to Palestine. Okay. So I didn't apply. And I went back a couple later. It was on a website. And I went back a couple weeks later, looked at it because they have a lot of different job opportunities there, and they would tell you when the applications had to be in by. Well, I went back and looked at some of these others, and there was Palestine again, and they had extended their deadline because I assumed they couldn't find someone they wanted. So I applied. I had applied at Shelbyville and didn't get an interview. I applied at Dietrich and did get an interview, but didn't get the job. And so I applied at Palestine. And it was not that I was just, my feelings were hurt when I didn't get the superintendency. Right up front, that was part of it. I felt like I had put 30 years of hard work in here, and that I felt like that it was something that I deserved at some point. But I really wasn't ready to move. It's hard to pack up and go. And my kids, this was their town too. So I went ahead and applied. I went down and interviewed. I told them I wouldn't move. My parents live a mile away from me. They're getting older. My in-laws live out of town, and they need me. And they said, okay. They said, we understand. And so for 6 years, I was superintendent at Palestine.
I didn't realize how long it was.
Yeah. I retired in 2012 from education. And you never really retire from education. Some of the other things that I did, you always feel like you have to give back. I loved Boy Scouts. I loved camping and being a part of that. So for a while, I was merit badge counselor for younger scouts. And I worked with the local troops here while I was in Marshall. I was in a group called New Leaders out of Eastern Illinois University. We mentor new principals. A principal is the most difficult position in education, by far. Much easier to be a superintendent than it is to be a principal. Principals are in there every day working with teachers. They work with not the best kids, and it's tough.
Problems daily, I'm sure.
Oh, every day, and every day is different. Russ Ross and I, we were part of New Leaders, and it was a group of us out of Eastern, and we would go with new leaders, new principals. We would go mentor them, give them a chance to talk. What problems do you have? Try to help them sort through things, bring them together at group meetings so they had a cohort to work with. It was really kind of fun. I did that for about 10 or 11 years. And really enjoyed that. And it was part of giving back. You know, people had helped me all the way along my life. So this was my opportunity to help them.
Is that New Leaders sponsored by EIU, or is it an independent?
It's sponsored by EIU. It's the Department of Educational Leadership up there. It started at U of I.
Oh.
And then and the person who organized it was Linda Morford. And she was, at that point, she was a principal up at University School in Champaign. Mm-hmm. And then she got a job at Eastern in the leadership department and moved the whole program down. And Eastern has kind of taken it under their wing and helped it keep going.
You mentioned Palestine 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
What happened then?
Well, I retired. I retired for a year.
In what year was that?
That was in 12. And then in 13, it'd be the 13-14 school year, Cumberland needed a interim superintendent, somebody to fill in. I could only work 2 days a week based on my pension, but that was okay. So I worked over there for a year, a couple days a week, helping a young man who was already a principal prepare to be the superintendent following me. So I was there for a year, kind of mentoring him and getting him started. And then I was off for a year. And I say off, you know, there's always something to do. This is why I'm saying God wanted me in Marshall. I didn't have to move to Palestine. I stayed here. Mm-hmm. I've never had to go anywhere, to pick up my family and move and go someplace else. God wanted me in Marshall. This year I'm in Kansas, Illinois, as an interim for 2 days a week. They needed a superintendent. It'll be a year, maybe two. And there's some very nice people everywhere. It's not like when I was in high school and everybody else was the enemy because they played football against us and they were the opponent. You find out that there's wonderful people everywhere. That's just kind of young kids, you know, it's them against us sometimes. And as you get older, you realize that the others are just people doing the same things you're doing.
In all of your experiences with people in Marshall and other places, mm-hmm. is there an individual who has really probably had the most influence on you?
I don't know that there's one individual.
You had several, I'm sure.
But there's several. Chuck Cargill was my football coach in high school. When I was in college and taking classes and wanted to talk football, the first couple of years I would come back on Saturday mornings. He had an insurance office not too far from here near the post office. And it's been a barber shop and it's been some other things in there now. But I would come down on the weekends and we'd just talk football. Things that he had always thought about doing and hadn't gotten to yet, and things, and gave me a better understanding of the X's and O's and things like that. And it was fun to talk to him. It was real difficult when he died of a heart attack about my junior year in college, and that was particularly difficult thing. Mr. Wyke, as a teacher, allowing us to think and do things, I thought was real important. My father always liked to learn. My father was a reader, an avid reader, and education. I think he always felt bad that he had never gotten to college. He graduated high school in the Navy. He was part of a year short when he got out of Marshall and started doing things and ended up getting his diploma in the Navy. Very intelligent man, and felt like he was always reading. He could always talk to you about something and discuss things.
I recall visiting with him too. He had an avid interest in scouting.
Oh yes, but see, that was his tie to us. Dad never played sports. My brother played football. I played a little of everything, but Dad never knew anything about sports. The first baseball bat I ever had, Mother bought it and showed me how to hold it, and she made me bat right-handed. And then when she went in the house, I'm a left-handed batter, and I would go to the other side because it felt more comfortable. And so I always batted left-handed. But Dad didn't know anything about it. He said Mr. Bush always wanted him to play football when he was in high school, but he had to work after school and never got a chance to do it. So scouting was our chance to be together as father and son and my brother. He got us involved in scouting very early. We were in Cub Scouts, and actually Mother was a den mother for a while at our house. And then he was an assistant scout master with Elmer Hoggett while we were in junior high and high school. And then there were two troops in town. Dad was a scoutmaster for a troop that was run by the Christian church, and then Elmer ran the American Legion post. So that was part of. I need to check something. Okay, that was part of our life together with Dad. Now, Dad had been in the Navy and that kind of thing. But I think what attracted him to Boy Scouts, and for us, it was a boys' thing, camping, going outside. Every spring, there would be a camp out at Paris or somewhere close by that would be a weekend deal. It was always over spring break sometime, and you would go up on a Friday, Saturday, come back on a Sunday. And then every fall, there was a fall camp out. And when I say, it wasn't just our troops, it was troops of the whole area, because Terre Haute was the center of this area.
Right.
And so there'd be troops from all over. And there'd be a fall camp out, and it'd be a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Well, Dad worked plumbers and steam fitters at the time, so he was always off working through the week. So that was his chance to be with us on the weekend. He'd come on a Friday night, we'd go someplace, set up the tents, and do all that. Then in the summer, we never took vacations, rarely ever took vacations. But in the summer, he would take a week off and go with us to Camp Crittenstein near Brazil, Indiana, and do a week camp. And we'd be gone all week there. And that was his vacation from work, and he was with us.
You mentioned your dad in construction and all, and I think you even mentioned you had helped him some in some renovation. You consider yourself then a handyman too?
No. Dad, the difference between Dad and I, as far as that goes, my brother got it better than I did. My brother tends to be a perfectionist type of guy. He understands detail. I have never been detail-oriented, and I admit that. I'm upfront with that. Some people are left-brained, some people are right-brained, and all of that. Did you prefer algebra or geometry?
I didn't prefer either one.
Either one of them.
But algebra I could kind of tolerate.
Algebra. People that are more left-brained, more detailed, more that kind of thing, really like algebra. Algebra, I never understood why you ever did algebra. It never made any sense to me. Even teaching science, you use a little algebra and I could apply it. But algebra was not my favorite thing. I loved geometry. It was all pictures. And when I take these tests, I'm more right-brained. And because I'm more right-brained, I tend to be more global. I tend to be less detail-oriented and more over the top. And probably one of my biggest deficits, and always has been my whole life, is I'm not detailed enough. And I need people around me who are. So when you're coaching, you want to make sure you have good assistant coaches around you that can do the things that you're not good at. And if you're a principal, you look for strengths in teachers that can do things. My dad was very detail oriented, and I'm sure I frustrated him sometimes when I wasn't. He could see all the different aspects of things. Now, could I go out and build a shed and make it stand? Yeah, I can do that. But not, yeah, I know, I would make, it would be plumb, I would do that. I've seen enough of that, but I'm not a builder as such.
Okay.
And so around the house, if I did something, it might not be exactly the way it should be. And my wife, who is very detail-oriented, might recognize that. So better let somebody else do it that knows how.
John, as a youngster, did you have some hobbies and all that maybe you've even continued up to that you're participating in as a retiree?
Playing sports, gardening.
No.
I love plants. And that's why I went from Zoe major to a botany and ended up with a lot of botany. And I'm about a class or two from a botany major. I love plants. I love nature. Trees. I couldn't live someplace where there weren't trees. I've been to Kansas, I've been out in the deserts, I've been all over the place. They may be very pretty. I wouldn't want to live there. Trees are substantial. They give you a feeling of permanence because they live so much longer than we do. And I don't know. I think that gardening is my hobby. And I started that probably junior high. My grandmother lived out where my mother lives now, and she always had a garden in the back. And my grandmother needed help, so I would go out and help her plant the garden. And we would hoe it up, and it wasn't huge, but it was something. She always had some corn, she always had some pumpkins, she always had tomatoes and things.
Fresh vegetables.
Fresh vegetables. And we'd go back, and she taught me how to fertilize it and water it and all that kind of stuff. And so that was kind of my start. Probably I was 13, 14, that kind of range. And I've just always enjoyed growing plants. And in my backyard, I have a flower garden that I take care of and mess with and move things around and add stuff to. And that kind
You've been involved in education so much, it's a part of your life. And it seems to me like education keeps changing.
Oh my. And
I guess some of the things I kind of wonder and worry about, but all of this modern and stuff with technology and all, and some places even doing away with cursive writing, these things, is education on the right track?
Well, things do change and things do evolve over time. And I'm not opposed to smart boards and computers and all of that stuff because they always told you they made things easier. They don't. They make things more complicated. You just have more complicated things to do. But the kids that are coming up now have never had a toy that doesn't have a flashing light or a sound to it or something else.
You need a battery for it.
And need a battery for every toy. My grandkids are like that. They get bored. They get bored if it doesn't flash. You and I like to sit down and read a book. I like the feel of a book in my hand. I want to turn the pages, all this. And even my daughters have the smart readers. Holly does that all the time. She's got novels on her reader. My grandkids, it's all flashing and things. It's how you're wired. And I don't mind education using the tools that the young kids follow. I don't mind that at all. The problem with education right now is that politicians get involved and they think that if they use education as a whipping boy that they can get votes, because everybody can relate to having gone to school sometime, having a teacher they didn't like or a teacher they did like, and every politician I know of stands up and part of their platform is, we're going to make it better.
Yep.
And they don't. Back when we were in school, Mrs. Irwin was a great teacher. You learned from Mrs. Irwin. We didn't have smart boards. We weren't used to smart boards. If Mrs. Irwin was still teaching today, she would have a smart board and the kids would still be just as engaged as they were now as they were when we were in school. She was a quality teacher. She could use any tool that was available and teach with it. The problem now is we're getting so sidetracked from teaching to evaluating kids. They have to have tests every so often. We have to look for progress. We have to have every kid college and career ready. And in truth, not every kid should go to college.
I agree.
Some kids should go out and work as a plumber and steam fitter, as my father did, welding things.
Still make some good bucks, do you?
Exactly. I mean, if you're a plumber and steam fitter and you come out with a welding degree, you will make between $50,000 and $60,000 a year, which is double the salary of a starting teacher. So just because you have a 4-year degree doesn't mean you have the opportunity to make more money. It's where your talents lie. And I think education is getting away from teaching kids how to use their talents to be the best citizen and the best worker in the community. And we're trying to test them all and force them into something that most of them aren't ready for. Only about 25% of your kids should go to a 4-year college. And we're telling them they all should be college and career ready. That's not right.
Do you ever think you would like to go back into the classroom?
Every time you go into teaching, that's why you went in. You went in to teach kids. And the difficult part of being a principal and an administrator is you get farther away from the kids. Superintendent, a lot of times, is even in a whole different building, and you never see the kids. I do miss teaching science. Science is something that there's a lot of aha moments in science where this happens because, and the kids go, that's why that works. And you mix a little potassium iodide and lead nitrate together and 2 clear liquids and they suddenly turn bright yellow. Oh, that's really neat. How did that happen? Then you can talk about it.
It doesn't blow up then.
Oh, no. No, it just turns yellow and a solid precipitates out of it. But that was something that kids really, it caught their eye. And if you use the right things you get that aha moment, and then you can discuss it. Or when I was teaching sociology, I remember one class that was particularly good. I could use my Mr. Wyke skills and talk about things and let them talk about things and debate things. And when they walked out of the class, it was like, wow, that class went really fast. I mean, they wanted to start at that same spot again tomorrow. And I think as a teacher, I have learned, and I would be a better teacher now than I was back then, because it doesn't matter so much what you teach. It's teaching kids how to learn so that they can go learn on their own when they need to. We get as a young teacher, you're so preoccupied with trying to get through the book. You don't need to get through the book. Yeah, okay. 2nd grade math is based on, you got to know some things from 1st grade math. Okay, there's some things like that. But I understood that I taught science, and 10 years later, they weren't going to remember anything that I had taught them. And if they did, I would be surprised, or at least glad a little bit. But if I taught them how to find the answers, it's like give a man a fish and he eats for a day, and you teach him to fish, he eats the rest of his life, that kind of thing. So I would be a better teacher now, that way, than I was when I started.
My mother taught for 35 years. I know she always said it was one of the most rewarding things she could do.
Yes, exactly.
And she enjoyed she taught 3rd and 4th grade.
The relationship between the student, it's like when I was coaching football. It's a family. Football is a family. It's a relationship between everybody there. And like every family, once in a while you have a squabble, and brothers sometimes, have problems. But when it's all said and done, we prayed before games. Not supposed to do that anymore. And I'm a little bit rebellious. I'll admit this. I'm a little bit rebellious. And I know that the court said you're not supposed to do that kind of thing. So we started doing it under the goalposts, in front of everybody, basically daring anybody to tell me no. And in Marshall, they're not going to. We prayed before the games. We played the games. We were brothers. And when the seniors got ready to graduate, the last football game, and you knew you were losing your seniors and they were like your kids that you didn't have anymore, we would line them up on the 40-yard line, and everybody else would go through and shake hands, saying, "Thank you for teaching us where we were."
Good. John, you mentioned you mentioned your family and your wife, but you didn't mention your daughters.
Well, I
know
mentioned
you
them a
have-
little bit.
Yes,
Let's talk
just a little
about
bit in
that.
passing. I know you have a couple daughters.
I have 2 daughters, Holly and Heather. Holly was born in 1978. And like every other parent, you brought her home from the hospital and you said, "Oh no, what have we done?" Holly and Heather are very different kids. And I guess I was a botany guy, and so they had plant names. Okay.
I hadn't associated that.
Holly was not born at Christmas. She was born on the Ides of March, so Julius Caesar beware. She's got 2 children now. Abby is 9 and Kate is 5. She's finding out that her 2 children are just very different, just like our 2 children were. Holly is a wonderful young lady, and I can call her young lady all of her life. She's very active. I think she's very active in the community. She's very active in the school. She is very active in her children's lives. As she grew up, she was very active in everything that we felt was important. I was always a Boy Scout guy, but Janet was in 4-H. And so Holly, from the time she was 8 years old until she was 18, was in 4-H. She was an excellent student. She's kind of like her father, pretty strong-willed sometimes, and she knows what right is and what wrong is and why doesn't everybody else follow.
Where does she live?
She lives northwest of Chicago in the suburbs in a town called Lake in the Hills. It's between Crystal Lake and Algonquin.
Yeah, okay.
About 4.5 hours away, which is way too far. But it's not terrible to get up on a Saturday morning and drive 4.5 hours so you can spend part of the weekend with them. She married David Jarofsky. They met in college. Holly cried when we first went to Northern Illinois University because it was too far away and she would be too far away from home. She met David and never moved back. Heather cried because she was going to go to Indiana State and it was too close. And she went 2 years to Indiana State and finished up at Northern. Both of them were physical therapists.
Okay.
And then Heather moved back to Terre Haute, so she is right back where she cried she didn't want to be. And she's pregnant right now. She'll have a baby in March. She married Brian Swan. Brian is a Marine who is going to Indiana State and finishing up a degree on the GI Bill and in construction management. And Holly married David Jarofsky. He's an electrical engineer. And if I could remember the company that he works for, I would tell you. I know he worked for Zebra Industries for a while, but barcode readers, they build printers and things.
The technical stuff.
All the technical stuff. And David's very technical. But Holly was, she played volleyball. She was a dancer on the Marshallettes while she went through school. Very bright, very energetic, always doing something. When Holly got tired, Holly was ready to go to bed. And that's what I remember part about her when she was a kid. She was ready to go to bed. Heather, on the other hand, stayed up until you had to make her go to bed. But then once she was asleep, she wouldn't get up. But Heather was a volleyball player, ran track. Milliken wanted her to come up and run track for them in college, but she wanted to be a physical therapist and went to college for college, and that was good. Both of them played softball. I was their softball coach in the summer and 9 to 12s, and we were on Jerry's Cafe, and we won the championship 4 out of 7 years, and we had a great time.
John, with all the technology and modern things we have around us, is there something you'd say, gosh, I just could not live without that?
No. Yeah, I've thought about that. I have thought about that. And you think about the Foxfire books that talk about how people used to do things in the old time ways, and the smokehouse and the summer kitchens and things like that. I don't know that there's anything that really holds me that says I can't do without it. If there were a fire in my house today, the thing that I would go in and outside of my family, that I would get out of the house, are the photographs that are in the closet in a box. Everything else, it is what it is, and if it goes, it goes. And if the internet broke down, I don't care. Because it's a relationship you have with people that's more important than an internet connection.
All the kids anymore seem to have a cell phone attached to the rear.
Right.
Well, John, it's been a delight visiting with you, and
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it. And you filled in some things I know that in the future people are probably going to be interested to hear. Say, gosh, I didn't know that about John Hasten. And that's what this whole project is about, not for today or tomorrow, but really for the future, as a part of history, and you like history.
I like it.
And there's one question I usually ask most folks before we wrap up. If you were visiting in another part of the country, or maybe even another country, and you said, I'm from Marshall, Illinois, and someone said, where's that, or what's that all about? What would you tell them about Marshall and why they might want to visit here?
Okay. Why would they want to visit here? And I haven't been all over the world, but it seems like wherever you do go, sometimes you find people who have that connection. I do want to say that I didn't say enough about Heather. Heather is a very intelligent young lady who is also a physical therapist, and I want to touch base with that. Our daughters are very, very different, but I love them both, and they're very, very close. And Janet is the love of my life and always will be. Marshall is the town that I've always lived in and probably always will live in. The thing that I remember about Marshall that I remember growing up is it's small enough that people know you, and close enough to a town like Terre Haute where if you needed something that you couldn't find here, you could get there. But the closeness of the people is and it's all about people. And I guess maybe that's why I'm in education. It's all about people. Heather was dating a young man from southern Indiana when she was going to Indiana State. And there was it would have been, 2003 or so, I think. Holly was getting married, and there was a wedding rehearsal over in Casey or someplace. The reception's at Casey, at Richard's Farm. And he was coming over to help. And I may not have the story exactly right as to what he was doing, but he was driving back home. It was probably going a little fast in the 45 zone on 40 out there. And he got stopped by the police. And they asked him who he was and what he was doing. And he said, well, I was over getting ready for Holly's wedding with Janet and John Hasten and Heather and all that. And they said, over there with the Hastens? Slow down a little bit, and sent him on. Part of being in a small town and having a reputation of being an honest and trustworthy person, and people know you for what that is you don't have that in the big towns. I don't know who any of Holly's neighbors are. We rode bicycles all over this town. We traveled on foot. We went to the pool. And there are places that I wouldn't want my kids to walk in other places, in other towns, that you would be worried about them, that you just don't know. Marshall gives you a better feel about it, that it's a great place to raise kids. And in education, we talk to a lot of kids. First thing they say is, I can't wait to get out of town. Can't wait to go do something else. This town's too small, it's suffocating. And then 5, 10 years later, here they are back again, because it's a great place to raise your kids. And yeah, we have our squabbles, and the city council fights through the newspaper, and all of that kind of thing. But over the years, what we've been handed as a quality town, it's our responsibility to hand to the next generation. And that's a good thing.
And that's very well said, John. We appreciate so much your taking the time out for this interview. It's been a delight. I've sure enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And as I said, it is for the future. And also, I think we want to thank you for all your years of education and helping our children and our youth along, and scouts and everything. So again, a big thank you. Appreciate it. It's been a delight.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it, John. You hit on